The cake was already cut. And the strangest part was that no one saved me a slice. I had baked it. A 3-layer lemon vanilla cake with cream cheese frosting, the same one my mother-in-law had requested every year for the past 4 years. I had driven 40 minutes to find the exact brand of lemon extract she liked. I had stayed up past midnight the night before, making sure the layers were even. And when my husband's family gathered around the table singing happy birthday, someone handed her the knife and she cut the first piece for herself. Then for my husband, then for his sister, then for his aunt who had driven in from Phoenix. And then my mother-in-law looked around the table and said to no one in particular, "I think that's everyone." I was standing right there. I smiled. I walked to the kitchen. I told myself she just forgot. That's what I always told myself, she just forgot. She didn't mean it. She's older and gets overwhelmed at gatherings. She doesn't realize. I had been telling myself that story for so long that I had almost started to believe I was invisible by choice. I wasn't invisible. I was just the one who made everything run so smoothly that no one noticed it was running at all. Let me back up. My name is Claire. I was 28 when I married my husband, and I was the kind of person who noticed things other people didn't: expiration dates on insurance policies, the moment a conversation was about to turn, the unpaid invoice sitting at the bottom of an email chain. My husband, for all the things I genuinely love about him, is not that kind of person. He's warm and funny, and he makes friends in every room he walks into. He is also the type who assumes that if something isn't on fire, it must be fine. His family is the same way. His mother owns 3 rental properties she inherited from her own mother. Nothing enormous, 2 small houses and a duplex about an hour outside of where we live. She had been managing them herself for years, which mostly meant she was not managing them at all. When my husband and I got married and I started coming around more, I noticed things within the first few months. A lease that hadn't been renewed in 2 years, still running month to month with no updated terms. A tenant in the duplex who had quietly stopped paying full rent and had been underpaying by $60 a month for so long that no one had caught it. A property tax bill that had been filed one day late 3 years in a row, each time incurring a small penalty that my mother-in-law simply paid without question because she didn't know she could dispute it. I didn't say anything at first. I just started keeping track. I'm not an accountant. I work in project coordination for a mid-sized logistics company. My entire job is watching moving parts and making sure nothing falls through the cracks. I can't turn that part of my brain off. So when I saw the lease issue, I drafted a new template and gently asked my mother-in-law if she'd like me to update her paperwork. She said, "Sure, honey, that would be nice." When I noticed the underpayment, I put together a simple ledger and showed my husband, who showed his mother, who called the tenant and resolved it within a week. 4 years of small fixes. Lease renewals, maintenance scheduling, insurance reviews, one situation where a tenant had caused damage, and I spent 3 evenings building the documentation that let my mother-in-law keep the full security deposit. I did all of it quietly, not to be a martyr. Just because I saw a problem and I knew how to fix it, and fixing it took less energy than watching it slowly get worse. Here is what I did not do. I did not ask for credit. I did not remind anyone what I had contributed at every family dinner. I did not make my help feel like a debt they owed me. I just helped. And I think that was my mistake. Not because I should have helped less, but because when people never see the effort, they eventually convince themselves there was no effort. By the time of my mother-in-law's birthday, the cake incident, I had been her unofficial property manager for nearly 4 years. I had a shared folder with all her documents, a spreadsheet tracking rent deposits, a calendar of renewal and inspection dates. I handled her communication with the property maintenance contractor she used because he was difficult to schedule and she found him frustrating. I had twice talked down a tenant who was threatening to break their lease early, which would have cost my mother-in-law more than 2 months of vacancy to replace them. None of this was in writing. None of it had ever been discussed as an arrangement. It was just understood by me, I realize now, far more than by anyone else. My husband's sister, who visited from out of state 2 or 3 times a year, had a particular talent for summarizing me in unflattering ways. At Thanksgiving the year before, she had described me to a family friend as basically a housewife, just not that domestic. I had laughed along with the table because I didn't know what else to do. My husband had not said anything. I told myself he probably hadn't heard. I got very good at telling myself things. After the cake incident, I drove home ahead of my husband because I said I had a headache. I sat in our driveway for about 10 minutes before going inside. I wasn't crying. I was doing something that felt quieter and more serious than crying. I was just finally, very clearly, seeing something I had been refusing to look at directly for a long time. The people in that house did not see me, and I had spent 4 years making myself so useful, so quietly indispensable, that I had accidentally taught them they didn't need to. I started documenting. I want to be precise about what I mean by that. I wasn't building a case for revenge. I was doing what I always do when something feels unstable. I was creating a clear picture of reality, because I had learned that reality tends to be more persuasive than feelings when the moment of reckoning arrives. I put together a summary of everything I had been managing. Dates, actions, estimated time spent, financial impact where I could calculate it. The late penalty I had identified and recovered twice over because I caught it in time. The security deposit documentation. The 4 lease renewals. The contractor scheduling. The tenant retention situations. I didn't add it up dramatically. I just laid it out. Then I made a decision. I didn't tell my husband right away. I needed to think it through clearly without his input, because I knew his instinct would be to minimize and smooth over, and suggest I was being too sensitive. And I needed to be certain before I had that conversation. The following weekend was a family lunch at my mother-in-law's house. My husband's sister was still in town. I went. I brought a salad. I sat at the table and listened to his sister describe her recent vacation in enough detail that I could have drawn a map, and I watched my mother-in-law laugh, and my husband lean back in his chair, looking completely at ease. And I made a decision. Zillow's like a decision and more like something that had already been made. I just needed to catch up to it. I would stop, not dramatically, not with a speech, just quietly. In the way that water stops running by closing a valve no one knew was open. I left the shared folder as it was, but stopped updating it. I let the calendar reminders go past without acting on them. The next time the maintenance contractor called about scheduling a routine inspection at the duplex, I didn't answer. I had always been the one he called because my mother-in-law found the coordination stressful. This time I let it ring. Then I let it ring again. Then I watched the inspection get missed entirely. My mother-in-law didn't notice for almost 3 weeks. Or if she noticed, she said nothing. The first sign that things were beginning to unravel was a missed rent deposit. One of the long-term tenants, a quiet retired couple who had always paid on time, deposited their rent 4 days late in the month because they had switched banks and had sent a message through the tenant portal explaining the delay. I had always monitored that portal. When I stopped checking it, no one else checked it either. My mother-in-law saw the missing deposit and called my husband in a panic, convinced the tenants were trying to leave. My husband called me. I was calm. I told him the portal likely had a message explaining it, and he should log in and check. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How do I log in?" I gave him the information. I didn't solve it for him. He figured it out. But it took him most of an afternoon, and he was visibly stressed when he came home. And he said over dinner, "I don't know how you keep track of all of that." And I said, "I don't anymore." He looked at me. I looked back. He changed the subject. But I think something landed. A week after that, the lease for one of the single-family properties was due for renewal. I had put it in the shared folder with a note dated 4 months earlier, flagging that it would need to be addressed before the end of the month. No one had touched it. The month ended. The lease slipped back into month-to-month status, which wasn't catastrophic but opened the door to complications I already knew were coming because that particular tenant had mentioned in passing, twice, that they were thinking about buying. A tenant who goes month to month and is already thinking about leaving is a 3-month vacancy waiting to happen. My husband's sister had gone back home by then. My mother-in-law called me directly for the first time in months, not to chat, but to ask if I remembered anything about the lease renewal she thought was coming up. I told her it had passed. I told her where the folder was. I told her the note was dated from October. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I thought you were handling all of that. I said, I was. I'm not anymore. Another beat of silence. Did something happen? I thought about the cake. I thought about the birthday table and the knife going from person to person and landing anywhere but me. I thought about 4 years of Sunday afternoons spent on contractor emails and lease templates. I thought about his sister's voice saying basically a housewife, just not that domestic to a stranger at Thanksgiving. I said, nothing specific. I just realized I had taken on more than made sense, and I need to focus on my own work. She said she understood. She thanked me. She hung up. I sat with my phone for a moment. I expected to feel lighter. I didn't, quite. It was more complicated than that. There was something like grief in it, because I had genuinely cared about doing those things well, and grief doesn't always wait for the right target. The call from my husband came 3 days later. He was in the car, and I could tell from the particular flatness in his voice that he'd been rehearsing what he wanted to say. He said his mother was overwhelmed, that she didn't really understand the property management stuff the way I did, that the contractor had rescheduled the inspection twice now, and she didn't know who to call to follow up, that there was something about a water heater in the duplex that needed documentation for the insurance renewal, and she couldn't find what she needed in the folder. He said he knew I was busy, but it would really mean a lot to him if I could just help get things back on track. I let him finish. Then I said, I put 4 years of work into that folder. Everything she needs is in there. If she can't find the insurance documentation, it's under the Duplex Insurances tab, subfolder labeled 2022 Renewal, because that's the last time I updated it. The contractor's direct number is in the contacts document on the first page. I'm happy to walk her through how to use the system, but I'm not going to keep running it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, why are you being like this? And I think that was the moment I understood the full shape of what I had been living inside. Not because it was cruel, he didn't mean it cruelly, but because he genuinely didn't know the answer. 4 years of work had become so thoroughly invisible that my decision to stop doing it registered as a personality change, rather than a reasonable response to being treated like furniture. I said, I'm not being like anything. I just stopped doing unpaid work for people who didn't know it existed. He came home that evening, and we had the real conversation, the one I had been waiting for him to be ready for. I had my documentation, not as a weapon, just as evidence, because I knew feelings would be disputed and numbers would not. I showed him the summary, the dates, the hours, the financial impact. I watched his face move through several expressions I hadn't seen on him before. He said, I didn't know it was this much. I said, I know. He said, I should have paid more attention. I said, yes. He asked me what I needed. I told him I needed him to understand that this wasn't about the properties, it was about the cake. It was about 4 years of his sister describing me as a housewife who wasn't even good at it. It was about his mother cutting slices for everyone in that room and looking around and saying, I think that's everyone, while I stood 3 feet away. It was about the fact that he had been in that room and had not said a word. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, you're right. I should have said something. That was the beginning of a different kind of conversation, one that was harder and longer than anything else in this story. I'm not going to pretend it resolved neatly in one evening. It didn't. But it started there, with him finally seeing clearly what I had been carrying. His mother, on the other hand, took longer. 2 weeks after I stopped managing the properties, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was the tenant from the single-family house, the one thinking about buying. She had been trying to reach my mother-in-law for 5 days about a leak under the kitchen sink that was getting worse and hadn't been able to get a response to the voicemails she left. She had found my number from an old email chain. She was apologetic about calling me, which made me feel worse than if she'd been frustrated. I gave her my mother-in-law's cell number and suggested she text rather than call. I did not take the problem back. I didn't call the contractor. I didn't draft a response. I just passed the number along and let it go. But I made a note of it. Not for any purpose I could have named at the time. It just felt like something I should write down. The call from my husband's sister came on a Saturday morning. She doesn't call me directly, or hadn't, before this. It was brief and strange. The way conversations are when someone is trying to ask for something without admitting they're asking. She said she'd been talking to her mother, and things seemed a little chaotic with the properties. She said she knew I'd been really helpful over the years, and she just wanted to check in and see if everything was okay between us. Because the last thing she wanted was for there to be some kind of tension. I thanked her for calling. I said there was no tension on my end. I said her mother had everything she needed in the shared folder, and I was available if anyone had specific questions about how to navigate it. She said, "So you're not going to help anymore?" I said, "I'm available for questions." She said, "Claire, come on. My mom's not going to figure that stuff out on her own." I said, "She figured it out before I came around." Silence. Then, that was different. She was younger. I said, "I understand that, but I'm not the right solution to that problem. If it's become too much for her to handle alone, there are property management companies that do this professionally. I'm happy to help her find one." His sister didn't say much after that. We wrapped up the call politely, which is a skill I have worked very hard to develop. The call from my mother-in-law came on a Tuesday evening. My husband was traveling for work. She called my cell, not his, which told me she had thought about the timing. Her voice was different than I had ever heard it, smaller, somehow. She said she'd been going through the folder, and she appreciated how much work I'd put into it, and she was sorry she hadn't said that before. She said she'd realized over the past few weeks how much had been running without her knowing it was running. I let her talk. I didn't fill in the silences. She said, "I think I took you for granted. I think we all did. And I want you to know I'm sorry for the birthday. I don't even remember cutting the cake and not including you, but your husband told me, and I can imagine how that must have felt, and I'm sorry." I believed her. I think it was genuine. I don't think she had ever set out to make me feel invisible. I think invisibility is just the natural fate of the person who makes everything easy, unless someone is paying deliberate attention. I told her I accepted her apology. I told her I wasn't angry. I was being honest by that point. The anger had moved through me and left something calmer behind. I told her that what I needed going forward was just acknowledgement. That if I contributed to something, I wanted it to be seen. Not praised, necessarily. Just seen. She said, "That's fair." She said it quietly, like someone agreeing to a term they should have agreed to years earlier. We talked for a while after that. About the properties. Yes, I walked her through a few things. Not to take the work back, but to help her understand it well enough to manage or delegate. About my husband, a little. About what I actually did for work, which she admitted she had never fully understood. Before we hung up, she said, "I always thought you were just being helpful, because that's who you are. I didn't think about what it cost you." I said, "It wasn't the cost. I like being helpful. I just needed to know it mattered." I have a photo on my phone from the birthday party. I didn't take it deliberately. My husband had been doing a little video at the table right before the cake cutting, and one of the frames caught me off to the side, slightly out of the shot, in focus, but not part of the moment. I found it a few days after the party, and almost deleted it. Instead, I kept it. Not as evidence, not as a reminder of what went wrong, just as a clear picture of where I had allowed myself to end up. I look at it sometimes. Not often. Mostly when I feel that old pull, the urge to quietly step in and fix something that isn't mine to fix. To be so useful that I forget to be present. To smooth everything over so completely that no one realizes I was the one doing the smoothing. The photo doesn't make me angry anymore. It mostly just reminds me what it costs to be invisible by convenience. Not just to yourself, but to the people who might have genuinely known you, if you had let them look. My mother-in-law hired a property management company 3 months later. I helped her interview them and select the one with the clearest communication process and the most transparent fee structure. She thanked me in front of my husband, specifically, by name, looking directly at me. He noticed. I noticed him noticing. His sister sent me a text a few weeks after that, which simply said, "I'm sorry for the things I've said." The housewife comment. "I know you heard it." I sat with that for a day before I answered. Then I thanked her and told her I appreciated it. I meant it. Apologies from people who don't have to apologize carry a different weight. My husband and I took a weekend trip by ourselves in the spring. No family obligations, no phone calls to take, no folders to update. We drove up the coast and stayed in a small rental with a porch that looked out at the water. The second evening, we sat outside after dinner, and he said, without me asking, "I've been thinking about how long I let things go unseen. I want to do better." He didn't dress it up or qualify it, he just said it. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "I know you do." And I believed him. Not because the problem was solved, these things don't solve cleanly, but because I had stopped mistaking his ability to overlook things for his capacity to see them. Those aren't the same. People can learn to look. They just need a reason to. I had given him one. There is a version of this story where I walked away from everything cut off, silent, starting fresh somewhere they couldn't find me. I understand the appeal of that ending. It's clean. It's satisfying. The scoreboard is unambiguous. But that's not quite how it went, and I don't think I would have wanted it to. What I wanted wasn't to disappear. I had already tried that, and it hadn't worked out well for anyone. What I wanted was to be seen by the people I had chosen to be around. And it turned out the only way to make that happen was to stop making it so easy for them not to. There's a version of being helpful that is actually a kind of hiding. You put so much energy into making things smooth that no one ever has to look at you directly. You become the background of other people's lives, essential, invisible, and eventually taken for granted so completely that your absence registers as a disruption rather than a loss. I was that version for a long time. I don't think I'll be it again. Not because I stopped caring about the people around me, I didn't. But because I finally understood that being genuinely present is worth more than being endlessly useful. And if the people in your life can't tell the difference, you might have to stop being useful long enough for them to find out. The cake, by the way, I still make it. I made it again the following year. Same recipe, same midnight layering. But this time, when she picked up the knife, she looked right at me and said, "Claire, you should have the first piece." I did. It was good.